Let's start with some exercises. So first, create a method named number of adults that takes an array of person and returns the number of adults in the array. So for this one, again, this one's a static method. We're not in the person class anymore. So public static returns the number of adults in the array, so int, and then number of adults that takes an array of person and now how will we count the number of adults? Well, first we need to keep track of it, and then we just loop through the array. For every person in the array, if p dot is adult, remember we have this method right here, then result plus plus, because then we have one more adult, then return the result. So now when we create one of these, and we pass it into the number of adults and print it, we should get that there are 2 adults. As shown below. The next one, create a method named total age that takes an array of person and returns the sum of the ages of the array, of the people in the array. So for this one, public static, these ages are ints, so their sum is going to be an int. And then total age takes an array of person. Again, just like any other way we sum something, we need to keep track of the result, so let's call that result. Then for every person in the array, result plus equals p dot age, and then return result. And now when I do like something like print the total age of our created array, it should be 60. Now next, so for this one, the average can be a double, like it can be a not integer. So for example, 7 and 8, their average would be 7.5. So in case that happens, we need to return the double. So we could use a loop, so basically sum the ages up and then divide by the length. Or we could just realize that we already have our total age method right here, so we can use that. So there is one problem though. So if I just do this, so this would work because, well, the sum just happens to be 60, the average just happens to be 20, which is the whole number. However, if we change this number to like 16, for example, now the average age is going to be 19.0 instead of the correct answer, 19 2/3. And the reason is because the total age, remember, returns an int. The length is an int, so we have int divided by int. That's integer division. So first it gets rid of the remainder. Then after we already calculated it to be, say, 19, which is already the wrong result, then we convert it to double, so it still remains the wrong result. How do we change that? Well, we can just make one of these double, like that. So now total age of people is turned into a double, and then double divided by int is no longer integer division. So then now we have basically the correct answer. Now, we know that these static methods that are defined in this public class can be accessed in the public class just by their name and their parameters. However, what about outside of this public class? For example, what if I make a new class? Now what if I try to do something like average age of, say, some person array? Let's just have the same person array. Actually, it won't work. And why? It's because this method, average age right here, is not in the same class as example 1. And in fact, how would I access it? I would have to do something like level 2 lesson 3 part 3 dot average age. Basically, the class name that the method is in dot the method. That's how I access the static method outside of the class it's defined in. Now, of course, this looks pretty messy, and it's clear that level 2 lesson 3 part 3 sometimes doesn't fit, like it's confusing sometimes. And I don't want to put level 2 lesson 3 part 3 dot average age every time I want to use average age, because it's just more confusing, and sometimes it's longer. So, another thing, what about inside the person class right here? Let's just say I want to call average age for some reason. Let's just call it with an empty array just for demonstration. That won't work. I would have to do level 2 lesson 3 part 3 dot average age. And of course you can see that's annoying. Even inside our person class, I must do level 2 lesson 3 part 3 dot average age. It's just not very good because level 2 lesson 3 part 3, you can't tell that it has something to do with person. Plus you must have access to level 2 lesson 3 part 3. So if person is part of the library, and most likely this random public class is not part of our library, then we're going to have to be able to access it. So that's not good. So how do we make it better? So we can actually move these static methods right here to inside of our person class, like that. How do I call it now? So unfortunately, inside of our level 2 lesson 3 part 3 class right here, we can't just directly call it by our name anymore. Now, how do I access it? Again, same rule. It's the class name dot the method. So person dot number of adults, person dot total age, person dot average age. And you see that this makes slightly more sense than level 2 lesson 3 part 3 dot average age. And now everything makes a lot more sense because number of adults, total age, average age are all stuff that has a lot to do with person. And it's person dot that method. So that makes sense all of a sudden. Now, don't get static methods and instance methods mixed up. Just because the static methods are in the person class doesn't mean that it's an instance method all of a sudden. So the differences between an instance method and a static method are basically static methods are called by their class, so person dot average age. However, instance methods are called by their object, or like by their instance. So like, for example, p1 dot is adult. And the reason of this is because, like, for example, is adult describes an individual person, you need a person to determine whether that person's an adult or not. But average age doesn't describe a specific person. Like, it doesn't make sense for a single person to have an average age. We're talking about, in general, the average age of an array. So that's like externally. That's external to a single person. So therefore, it's not the property or method of a specific person. And next, another thing is that instance methods are allowed to access instance variables like this. So like, you see is adult method right here, it's an instance method. It's allowed to access age. And why is that? Well, because age is a specific property of our specific person, but we're inside of our specific person with our instance method. We're allowed to access the age. However, right here in total age, for example, which is our static method, we have to do p.age. Basically, for an instance variable, you always need an object. So basically, you can't just do system.out.println age, for example, or anything to do with age. System.out.println age, not allowed. Age equals 5, not allowed. Why? It's because, again, non-static variable age cannot be referenced from a static context. So basically, if we're in a static context, we're not within a specific person, so what age? Like, age of what, right? It's the same logic as just saying, like, age equals 5 in the main method. Like, age of what, right? That doesn't make sense. p1.age equals 5 makes a bit more sense, but just age equals 5 doesn't make sense. Same thing for inside the class, because they're also static methods. Another thing about instance methods that's different from static methods is that instance methods cannot be put in any other class. So basically, for example, over here, our isAdult method, if we put that out here, all of a sudden that doesn't make sense. Because think about it, isAdult is a method of the person. It doesn't make sense for level 2 less than 3 part 3 to have isAdult. Also, what is age, right? We don't even have age. So that doesn't even make sense. Same thing with instance variables, for example. Int age. We could do that, but now all of a sudden, this thing has nothing to do with person. However, static methods can be put in other classes without significant problems. Like earlier, our total age, average age, number of adults were all in our level 2 less than 3 part 3 class. That was fine. It was just that it was awkward when we called it. But instance methods, we cannot do that. They must stay in their class. If they're related to person, they must stay in the person class. Now, just like we can create static variables in our public class like this, we can also create static variables in our person class or in any class in general. So static int population, for example, set to 0 would be an applicable example. So now, basically, let's just say we want our population variable to keep track of how many people we created. So how do we do that, right? We can't just, there's no external way of determining how many people we created. So how would we do this? Well, simple. Every single time I create a person, I increase our population by 1. Therefore, the population variable now accurately keeps track of how many people we have. Now, you may notice that this is a constructor and it's accessing a static variable In general, constructors or instance methods can access static variables. So in general, static cannot directly access instance unless you have a specific object. Then you must do it through the object. And instance can directly access both static and instance. Whereas static, you can only access static. So now, for example, if I print person.population, it's going to be 3 because we created 3 total people. However, if we make a new person, now all of a sudden it's 4. It doesn't matter that we didn't make this a variable. We still called the constructor. We still created another person. Now, you may have noticed that I only put population plus plus inside of our 4-parameter constructor, but we didn't do that in our 1-parameter constructor. Now, why is that? It's because our 1-parameter constructor calls our 4-parameter constructor. So therefore, it's already going to call the population plus plus. If we put population plus plus again over in this constructor, it's going to increase population by 2 instead of 1. And as shown above right here, we used the 1-parameter constructor, yet it did increase the population. Now, there's some exercises. Determine whether the following should be instance or static variables in the person class. So, for first, age should be an instance variable because every person has an age. It's a specific property of a person. What about population? Well, that should be a static variable because, well, we don't have a population of a single person. Like, a person doesn't contain a population. We don't need a specific person for a population. It's just a general thing. Height, well, that's instance because, well, every person has a height. It's a specific property of a person. What about hair color? That would be instance. For the same reason, eye color, that would be instance. What about city class? So determine whether the following should be an instance variable, static variable, instance method, or static method. So the following. Well, let's see. The age, that's a specific property of the city class. So therefore, it should be an instance variable. Population, again, don't get that mixed up with person's population because the city actually has a population. It's a specific property. Instance variable. Number of cities. Well, unless you have a city that contains a bunch of cities and that's normal. Normally, number of cities would just be like number of cities overall we generate. So that would be a static variable. Is capital. That could be an instance variable or instance method because all of these could also be instance methods. For now, let's just make them instance variables because later on, you'll learn that it can be useful to create instance methods to access instance variables. Create building, that's definitely an instance method. No excuses. Because it's not an instance variable because create building is an action, it's not a property. It's not static at all because it's related to this specific city. So then it has to be an instance method. Area, again, instance variable. Again, all of these instance variables could be instance methods as well, but they should definitely first be instance variables. And one last thing is that note that static variables and methods always have the word static in them, but instance variables and methods, they don't have the word static, but they also don't have the word instance. They just have their public or and then return type and then name and then parameters. The only difference in terms of like writing the code is that static methods have and variables have the word static, while instance methods and variables just don't have the word static.